Welcome to the Story a Day podcast. This is Julie Duffy, encouraging you to be a writer today, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. This is Julie from Story a Day, and as I record this, we are just a couple of days away from the end of Story a Day, May 2021. It's the 11th year that I've been in this position, and so the 12th time I've been through the May challenge. And it never really gets any easier, does it? I mean, the actual writing, I think what gets easier is that you understand that the actual writing is always going to be hard because you're always leveling up. It's one of the things that I never really understood about physical exercise when I was younger was that it wasn't that you went to the gym and then it suddenly became easy. It was that when it became easy, you started pushing yourself harder. I think what does get easier when you've done these kinds of challenges, or when you've written 4 novels, or when you've written 165 stories, what gets easier is just that understanding that there are moments when it's hard and that you personally have to find a way to get through those moments and not just get distracted by a shiny object of a new story or wander off to the fridge and never come back. The thing that changes is your ability, your understanding of the tips and tricks you need to keep yourself at the desk, to get to the end of the story, to make this thing happen. So today I want to take you through an exercise that I recommend, which is the post-challenge debrief. That's what I call it. It's where you sit down with yourself and you have a little conversation about what went well, about what you learned, both positive and negative. I hesitate to say negative because I think any lessons learned are helpful, even if it was, I hate this thing. Very helpful to know what we hate so we can avoid it in future. I don't think it is helpful to work in a way that feels hard. And you're probably hearing a lot of people talking about this idea at the moment, in part because there's an author called Greg McKeown who had a very popular book a couple of years ago called Essentialism, and he's out with a new one now called Effortless. It's not a new idea, but it's one that's gaining traction, and I think it's the kind of thing that successful people have long known, that if you enjoy, if it feels easy to do a thing, you are more likely to do it. So you don't actually have to grind and pump and squeeze and crush if you're doing something that comes easily to you. The problem is that sometimes when we're doing something that comes easily to us, we don't value it properly. There are lots of other people who will not value what you're writing, so don't you be one of them. Those of you out there who write romance know what I'm talking about. Science fiction writers 40 years ago knew what I was talking about. There are other people out there who will tell you that what you're doing is it's just that trash, popular, easy stuff. And it might affect your decisions about what you write. But I think just as the literary world has come to an understanding that, anything can be well written, and there's not quite as much literary snobbery, certainly not from people who actually love it, love writing and storytelling. You can tell a literary story or a romance story or a science fiction story, and it can be amazing. The danger is especially when people are new or insecure, to think that something that comes easily is not valuable, is dangerous. So it's good to know the things that you don't like to do, the things that feel really, really hard, because maybe they're not the things that you should do. Somebody else might find writing romance easy, you might find it hard. Somebody else might find writing literary stories and poems easy. It's where their comfort zone is. You might find it hard. So go and write your military sci-fi, okay? This is a lesson that I think is having a moment at the moment as our world and economy kind of shake out from it. Historical processes take time, and our world and economy are in the West are still shaking out from the end of the factory system and the job for life system, even though those things haven't existed in my entire adulthood, really. But I think our culture and our economy are sort of slowly catching up to that. And for a lot of us who are slightly older, we've got a lot of things to unpack and unlearn. And that idea that you have to grind and be uncomfortable and be working really, really hard is kind of only if you're in the wrong gear. So the point of challenges like Story a Day are to help you find the right gear for you, the right path for you, the right tires for you. I'm going off on a cycling metaphor now. But the exercise that I think is useful to do at the end of this month, my post-debrief challenge, goes a little bit like this. And you might want to grab a piece of paper and a pencil and write these things down. Get ready to pause the podcast, because here's the first exercise. Important, not just to write the stories, it's important to capture the lessons learned so that you can refine everything about your writing. It's one of the steps in the writer code that I talk about. Writing is one of the first steps. Imagining is the first step. Write is the second step. Refine is the third step. Because if we don't learn from what we're doing and then make changes, we're just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again, and we're never going to get anywhere. So this is part of the refine process. Before you can improve, you need to kind of take a clear-eyed look at what you're doing and then see where it can be tweaked. So this post-challenge debrief, which you can do anytime in June, you can do anytime, is helpful, I think, to figure out what's next for you. So exercise 1, what did I learn about my writing practice? So you can break this down even further into ideas. Did you find that it was best to have a list of ideas before you sat down to write? Or was it best to come up with something on the spot? Did working with the prompts help you, or were you happier to work with something from your own story worlds and the writing you've done before? Or was it some kind of blend of the two? What were your most productive days in terms of ideas? So write about that for a few minutes, pause the podcast, think about that, and then come back to this next part of the first exercise, which is about your writing practice. What was the best time of day that you found for your writing? And did that surprise you? I quite often find that people think they can only work at a certain time of day. And then when you do a challenge like this, or you're on a deadline for a book, you suddenly discover that you can work a lot more times of day than you thought you could. And sometimes people find out that a different time of day is actually more productive. So have a think about what the best time of day to write for you was, what the absolute worst time of day for you to write was. Me, that's probably 2 p.m, but I can do it if I have to. And if I'm in the middle of a project, so think about the time of day and what factors affected your ability to write at that time. Next part of this exercise is what worked best for you, writing every day or taking days off. And think about when you wrote every day, when you tried to write every day, how many days could you write in a row before your energy sagged and you started to kind of resent it and wish you didn't have to write anything? Or if you wrote every day, did you discover that it made you more energized and more likely to write? This is different for different people. I know people in both of those buckets. So think about it for yourself. The next part of this first exercise is to think about the environment that was best for you. Normally, in normal years, I ask people if they write best in kind of like a busy coffee shop environment, or if they need their fortress of solitude or something in between. This year, I suspect very few of us have had the opportunity to write in a coffee shop, but you've possibly been able to either recreate that with ambient sounds on your headphones, or you've been in your house with your whole domestic entourage swirling around you, and you've had to figure out how to write at the kitchen table while people are cooking meals and people are doing homework and, whatever. So you can write down what kind of environments seem to work best for you. Sometimes I find when I'm getting started, it helps to be somewhere quiet, but once the writing is going, I quite often enjoy being in a more noisy environment. I also take naps really well in a noisy environment, which is weird. Weekends versus weekdays. How did they differ for you? Which was better? Which days made it easier to write and which days made it harder to write? Everybody has different answers for this, and it doesn't always track with whether or not you have a full-time weekday job. It varies. It doesn't matter what anybody else answers. Your answer is the only one that matters for you. Sometimes it's useful to see how other people work and how other people get their writing done. But in general, the only thing that's ever going to work for you is what works for you. And it's our job to figure out what works for us. Another question in the practice bracket, this practice exercise, as we look at all the things that worked. How did special events impact your writing? You went through a whole month of writing. It's very likely that you had something out of the ordinary that cropped up. That's why these kinds of challenges are so useful, because in your head you can say, oh, I'll sit down and I'll write every day for, on between 9 and 11 or between whatever. And we forget to build in things like unexpected visitors, birthdays, pre-planned social things we can't get out of, obligations that we can't get out of. There may have been fewer of those planned things this year, but it's quite likely that some of you had a birthday crop up during May, or that somebody called you, somebody invited you to a special event virtually. So when these things cropped up, did they derail your writing or did they provide a welcome reset and recharge? Have a little journal about that. Maybe pause the podcast and come back. That's the end of the what did you learn about your writing practice section of the debrief. Exercise 2 is going to be all about what you learned about your writing. And that's going to be on next week's podcast. In the meantime, I'm going to leave you with today's writing prompt from Story Day May 2021. And if you haven't written today, you can have a think about that, or you can save it and come back to it later. And next week, I'll come back with the next exercise in your post-challenge debrief. But before I go, there's two more questions I want to ask you while you are in the mode of debriefing after the challenge. The first one is, what is your next big goal for your writing? It's very easy for people to end the challenge and feel really good and think that they've fixed whatever habit flaws they had. But you've just completed a big challenge. You've done this thing. It is complete. The month is complete, or it will be in a couple of days, depending on when you're listening to this. And you need a new goal. So come up with a new goal for your writing. I don't know what that's going to be for you. And anything you choose may not be the right goal, but try and make it something that you control. So the goal is not to get published by the end of the year. The goal is to finish your big project by the end of the year. Something you control. And then the second question I'm going to ask you before we head out for the day and before I give you the writing prompt is, based on what you learned about your writing practice, the exercises we just went through, how are you going to achieve that next goal? How are you going to stay on track? Are you going to come to the Story a Day blog on the first of every month and post in the Swagger group, the Serious Writers Accountability group post, and post in the comments there about what you've achieved this month and how you're getting on towards your goal and what you did last month? Are you going to join a writers group? Are you going to commit to a certain number of words or hours next week? Are you going to put writing dates on your calendar? Are you going to go to the noisy environment you liked? Are you going to find a fortress of solitude? Are you going to take breaks? Are you going to write at a certain time of day? Write some of this stuff down so that it's here and it's on paper and that you can refer back to it on days when you're not as excited about your writing. Writing down goals is useful if we keep referring back to them and imagining ourselves in that place where we're achieving our goals. We're writers. We've got a huge advantage over mere mortals when it comes to goal setting, because goals happen when you can really picture it, when you can really feel and imagine what it's going to be like to be on the other side, to be the kind of person who sits down to write X days a week, to be the kind of person who's working towards getting your project finished and posting at the Swagger group every month without fail. And, you have to kind of build up that image of yourself doing the thing, to working towards your goal, maybe having the goal. And we are streets ahead of other people because our imaginations are so vivid. Got us in trouble at school, right? Daydreaming, staring out the window, making up stories in your head. But now it comes into focus and becomes something that's actually helpful to us. A lot of people have trouble with goal setting because they can't imagine the way that we can. So, based on what you have learned about your practice during the challenge, what are you going to do to get yourself to that exciting, tingly goal that you just set? Write it down, pin it up somewhere where you can see it, and don't just look at the list on the paper. Every time you look at the list stuck to your wall, remember the thrill you felt when you set that goal and why you set that goal. I will be back next week with some extra exercises for the post-challenge debrief, and I'll be back after this little break with a writing prompt. If you want to learn to write, don't read another book or article. Start writing. I'm here to invite you to consider the Story a Day 3-Day Challenge. It's a challenge and a workshop that gets people writing and completing stories in just 3 days. And it works. I'm fanatical about getting more and more diverse stories into the world, and I think yours should be among them. If you're feeling the pull to write or level up your storytelling, let me hold your hand through 3 days of short story writing. Check out the 3-day workshop at storyaday.org/3DC. This prompt is inspired by one that was given to us by a guest prompter a few years ago, a writer called Tadzio Kolb, who suggested that you tell the same story but from 3 different points of view. So the same incident happens, the reader sees it once from one perspective, then you go back and you see it again from another perspective, and then you see it again from another perspective. I love this idea because it lets you play with voice. It lets you play with the idea of the unreliable narrator. It lets you take readers inside different characters and different values. It lets you think about how different characters speak and approach a problem, and the perspective that somebody from a very different background would bring to the same incident. So think of something that happens. It could be something in a public place like a car crash or a fair, or just something that happens that involves more than one person. And then think about 3 very disparate people and points of view that could observe and be affected by and interact with this situation. And then write them as a series of little flash fictions. A flash suite. So, it could be longer if you want, but I'm going to suggest if you keep the whole thing, either write 3 that are under 1,000 words, but I think it would be really cool to keep the whole thing under 1,000 words, which keeps you to roughly 333 words per perspective. And they don't have to be equal. Somebody can get more stage time than somebody else. You may find that for the pacing, it can have, one of them can be much longer. Maybe the first one's short and the last one's really short and punchy, and the middle one tells us more of what we need to know, or mix them around, play with that. And remember that in each little vignette, each little perspective, there's a journey for that character, from going about their everyday life, to seeing the thing that happens, to reacting to the thing that happens. And you may find that there's a common theme that emerges as your three characters interact with the same event. And it might not be related to the event. I think this is the kind of story where if you just relax and write it, you'll be able to look at it afterwards and say, oh, there's a theme, and that's the theme. At which point you can start playing with titles once you know what the story's about. Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at storyaday.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week, and of course, keep writing.